Okay, well, our last presentation for today is Dr. Kimball's part two of what he talked about earlier. So we'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, Kelly said that they saved the best for last, but I'm not quite so sure. So anyway, this is just a continuation of what I talked about, was speaking about plasticulture. So, and this is, obviously with plasticulture, I said fertigation, irrigation are critical pieces of it. So, and you can't get away from it. So I'm going to talk about a few little math problems, but very simple. You all have the handouts so you can follow along if you have questions. But let's go ahead and get started. All right. Fertigation is uniformly applying a certain amount of fertilizer through the drip irrigation system. So, and fertigation, the general term is called chemigation. So there's actually a number of pesticides that can be injected through drip irrigation system. And so we're speaking specifically about fertilizers, and these are soluble fertilizers. Whenever you're looking about with your drip system, they always must be greenhouse grade fertilizers. So you cannot use the commercial grade because they will never dissolve. So those require soil activity, and it'd be put out in the soil and be weathered and things like that to break down. So that already makes it a little bit unique. So, and unfortunately, with a lot of the soluble fertilizers, they are a little bit more expensive. But remember, when we talk about fertigation and we talk about plasticulture, we're talking about increased yields. So normally the fertilizer costs are more than offset by the higher quality and the higher yields. So with this high tunnel, so with peppers and eggplants, but with a lot of times when you think about when you go through, does everybody soil test? You ever soil test your soil? It is easily the most overlooked for and most useful thing you could possibly do. So do they charge here for soil? So, but they go to all the county offices, right? Just bring the samples there. So that's the way it's typically done in Alabama. So, but you will get more useful information from a soil test. You will know how much fertilizer to put in your crop, period. Otherwise you guess. And when you guess, you're going to spend more money, or you're not going to spend enough money. You're not going to get the quality that you should have gotten. So I talked a little bit about nutrition earlier, really about colors and things like that. If you want to have the best colored fruit, if you want to have the best tasting fruit, fertility needs to be a significant portion of the equation that goes into your production cost. If you fall down on it, you can affect quality, you affect taste. So because the plant simply does not have enough nutrients to do what it needs to do. So the nice thing about fertigation is it doesn't matter how big your system is. It could be 1 acre, it could be 30 feet, it could be 10,000 acres. If it is set up correctly, you will inject the same amount of fertilizer uniformly through that entire area. So, but its key is using the correct type of drip tape, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So, but the scheduling and the amount that you put out is going to differ depending on the crop and the stage of that particular crop's development. So, so you're not always going to be putting out the same amount of product at any particular given time. So that can make it a little bit complicated when you're growing a large mix of crops, in the same area. Sometimes it becomes a bit of a plumbing problem for you. You end up sort of having to divide things up or to be able to control individual rows. And the nice thing is they make every possible kind of fitting you could possibly imagine with plasticulture and irrigation, where you can actually physically turn off rows, turn them on. So there's a lot of ways to actually do this. And usually it becomes a problem that you figure out on paper to figure out really the best way to set everything up. Normally with fertigation is you're primarily injecting nitrogen, potassium. Your soil test basically tests for everything, including potassium. Nitrogen is very soluble. It leaches from the soil very quickly. It gets used very quickly. It doesn't last. That's why we side dress typically. So, we talk about traditionally on bare ground, normally we put out pre-plant fertilizer. A couple weeks later, we put another plug of fertilizer. Then we put another plug of fertilizer typically out there. Fertigation, what you're doing is you're trying to sort of flatten that curve. Instead of getting spikes in plant growth, you're trying to just keep it nice, even, smooth production. So we found that when we do that, so we get better quality in the long run. All right. So anyway, we primarily put out nitrogen and potassium, and I'll sort of show you an example of this. They often end up being calcium nitrate and potassium nitrate. Dr. Snyder mentioned about not using much ammonium fertilizers in the greenhouse, and that's true with most vegetable crops. Honestly, the mechanisms complicated, but not impossible to understand. But generally speaking, most of the vegetable crops, sort of with the exception of the grasses like sweet corn, they really do better with more on the nitrate side. So you ever notice like bell peppers, sometimes when you harvest them, they get really brittle and they break apart. That's really common when you use really high levels of ammoniacal nitrogen, so a lot of ammonium types of fertilizer. And unfortunately, a lot of the fertilizers we buy, you know, that first number in your fertilizer analysis, that's the actual, you know, like a 10-10 ton. That first 10 is the actual percentage of nitrogen in that product. So, and a lot of times, you know, on your bag of fertilizer, it always has to tell you the constituents. And then very often it's going to say ammoniacal nitrogen is the highest percent. Urea might be also a significant, like a lot of the lawn fertilizers, that's typical what you're going to see. And to get that number really high, like higher than 10, 15, up to 20, in that 20, you have to use a lot of ammonium nitrate, unfortunately. So fertilizer selection sort of becomes important, but it's not impossible to figure it out. So, but the soil test by far is the first key to figuring out. We do have organic options that are out there, and I'll show you some of those in a second. But remember, it's soil test. You've got to base what you do on your soil test. You know, each of the land grants, they have a process called calibrated soil test. So that means for your soils in your state, you're going to have an exact liming recommendation, and you're also going to understand what other nutrients you may need to put out there. But you always end up putting out a portion of N pre-plant and a portion of potassium pre-plant, and usually everything else may go out ahead of time, so it may be incorporated before you actually do any bedding. All right. When do you start injecting? This is easily the most common question somebody asks me when they first get into fertigation and using plasticulture. You always want to start within 1 week of transplanting or 1 week of when your seedlings begin emerging. So if you wait much longer than that, research has shown you can actually impact on growth and development of the plant. So you don't want to stress the plants. So within 1 week. And you want to continue through last harvest. So, and that's, I mentioned this morning, but it's follow through. You know, we talk about the swing of swinging a golf club or swinging a baseball bat. We don't stop here with the baseball bat. We keep going around. It's the same thing with fertigation and with crops. We have something called fertigation tables for most of our major crops, and it's actually in your Midwest handbook. But in there you'll find a table, and it says, all right, on day 0, you start putting out this much nitrogen per acre per day. So, and then it'll change as the crop begins advancing. And it's designed to go through the last harvest, because if you really want to maintain quality and get everything out of that, you've got to continue it. A lot of times we just have a tendency to like, oh, well, we're a couple weeks from my last harvest. Why am I going to really worry about it? What's going to happen is you may not size up those tomatoes like you could have. And that's money in your pocket that you don't have. So, you know, so remember, the fruit's not just water. It's basically a nice package of water with some vitamins and nutrients added into it. So, and without sufficient water and without sufficient nutrients, that package of water is not going to be the size you want it to be. And if it also lacks fertilizers, like in the case of Farmer Dre was talking in the room in there about, you know, the issues of potassium. So potassium really can affect flavor significantly. So when they're lacking, that is one of the first symptoms when I taste a fruit going, you know, I mean, there may have been a problem with potassium in it. So, and it's always important too, is it's each element's important, not just nitrogen, not just potassium, not just phosphorus. So we've got 16 elements that are typically make up, you know, go into it, you know, into these vegetable crops: nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, sulfur, etc., with the microelements in this. So 16. So, and we only really worry about applying 13 of those things. We have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen that comes from the atmosphere and water and things like that. But it's those others, and they're all equally important. Even though you may only need minuscule amounts of one, it's just as important as nitrogen. Even though we talk about nitrogen because that's what the plant needs the most of. So, but if any of those become limiting in there, it will affect the quality. It will affect your ultimate yields. So, all right. Leaf tissue sampling. Has anybody ever used that? You're familiar with what that is? I'm going to show you what that is, but to check the progress of your crop, that is the only way to do it, and the only way to do it correctly. And it doesn't matter whether you're an organic grower or you're growing conventionally. So that is the only way that you can physically see what is in your plants, what's made it from the soil into that crop. And a lot of times, like if somebody calls me out and is having a problem, I will often tell them, I said, all right, I want to see your soil test results, and if you haven't had them done, let's go ahead and get one done now, and let's get a leaf tissue analysis done, because I want to know what's in the soil, and I want to know what made it actually into the crop. So it is one of the best diagnostic tools that it's out there. So, and it's the same situation with your soil lab, right? You just bring a sampling, and I'm going to show you more about that here in a second. So, so leaf tissue analysis. I'll talk a little bit about fertilizers and the types that are out, but normally when we inject fertilizer, we try to dissolve the fertilizer in the minimum amount of water and inject it. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. When to inject? Only inject after the system is fully pressurized. So these drip tape works under 10 to 12 psi typically. So it's low pressure, high volumes of water. So the drip tape, for the most part, is about 5/8 inches in diameter, right? You can actually run out of water if you have your runs too long. I've seen growers do that. So I'll talk more about that in a second too. But changes in water pressure can affect the uniformity of the way the fertilizer goes out. So, and with that, like for example, if you're using a wells cycle off and on, so the pressure goes up and down. So you never want to start injecting your fertilizer when you first turn your system on, because you've got pressure fluctuations. So everything has to be basically even. So, and I'll show you a couple of pictures of what you typically do for a setup. You need pressure gauges on there so you can read what the pressure is in your system. So, and you're hoping it's going to be 8 to 10 psi or up to 12, depending on the taping you might be using. This is if you don't wait till your system is fully pressurized, you get uneven distribution. Has anybody ever used a soaker hose before? You've all seen that. Soaker hoses are made out of a slurry of recycled tires. And if you ever notice, like whatever's near the spigot gets the most water, whatever's at the end tends to be the driest. That's sort of the kind of situation you run into if the drip tape is either not set up correctly or if you get some weird, fluctuations in pressure. That's why you want the system to be fully pressurized, because you get a lot more fertilizer at one end and only a little bit at the other end. All right. This is, for extension education, we always like doing things that are visual. So one of the things you can do is you'll lay out your drip tape in an area. In this case, the drip tape was laid out and dye was injected. Instead of fertilizer, we simply put a dye in there, like a blue dye that's typically in fertilizers, in order to show the wetting front that occurs. So the drip tape was on the very top. You see where the top, where it says 9 inches at the very top with the ruler there. So we removed the drip tape, took the plastic off, and this is showing you the way the water actually moves through the soil. So just to give you an idea, to show you how uniformly it's actually distributed. And if you were to look down this whole row, it would be the same way. It's pretty amazing the way drip tape works, and it's really just really simple engineering, and I'll also show you some pictures. When you do inject your fertilizer, you always try to inject it towards the end of your irrigation event. You don't want to do it up front, because what would happen is, you see that blue area, you would push that blue area away. If that blue area was the fertilizer and you kept injecting water, you're going to push the blue away. So you're going to push it away from the roots. So what you try to do is inject your fertilizer towards the end of whatever your irrigation event is. But again, I'm going to talk more about that in a second. What are the types of fertilizer we use? So the nice thing is we do have some selections. So potassium nitrate and calcium nitrate are probably make up the bulk of what's actually of a soluble water-based soluble fertilizer. So there are other products out there. Certainly, ammonium nitrate used to be very common. Now, ammonium nitrate, if I'm going to, as you know, is every time fuel prices go up, gas prices go up, fertilizer costs go up, because it's all based. That's how everything is produced, through petroleum, for the nitrogen. So nitrogen's expensive. Ammonium nitrate, unfortunately, we can make bombs out of, so availability becomes a bit of a problem right now. So it can be a challenge in some parts of the country to actually find it. And but you can find it's not a bad fertilizer to use, but if you're going to use it, it's cheaper. So, but use it for your initial pre-dress, for pre-bedding, before you put everything out there. So do not use it for any type of injection. So try to stay away from it. Stick with the nitrate forms. There are UAN solutions, urea ammonium nitrate solutions, and I'll show you those in a second. There's several different types of fertilizer, pre-dissolved materials you can buy out there, but my preference is to buy the material that you end up having to dissolve in water, because otherwise, it's convenient, but you are paying to have water shipped to yourself and a little bit of fertilizer. And I've always found that, frankly, it goes against my Scottish background to spend more money than I need to in something if I could do it easily myself. And it's not complicated math, and it's not chemistry. So, but I'll show you more about this in a second. So you've got these materials, so primarily for nitrogen, for potassium. The other one we typically inject, potassium nitrate, potassium sulfate, potassium chloride are probably the most common products. And really, depending on what your crop you're growing, we can make various combinations of these things to meet your demands of whatever the fertilizer needs are out there. So a lot of times the fertilizer salesman you might be dealing with, they may be able to help you on it. Somebody like myself can help you say, hey, Joe, I want to grow this crop. Here's my soil test. What do I need to move forward? You know, and that's where your regional agents and things like that can help you figure it out. So there's a lot of options out there. So not just one. So depending on the particular situation. So a lot of times, like we have in Alabama a problem with low potassium soils. So we will tend to use products like potassium sulfate occasionally just to make sure we're bumping up the level of potassium in the soil. All right, dry versus fertilizer solutions. So again, I find the dry much easier to use. You can buy it in bulk just like you can the already dissolved solutions. But when you're figuring out the fertilizer rates that you need to put out, it's a little bit higher math than most of you know, when we all talk about high school math and not wanting to deal with it anymore, well, this is college level math that you've got to deal with because it's based on the weight of water and how much product is in there. How much does the product weigh per gallon? You know, versus how much does a gallon of water weigh. So a gallon of water weighs about 8.5 pounds when it's pure. So if this product is 10.3 pounds, that means that difference between 8.5 and 10.3 is how much fertilizer is in there. You got to take that information and plug it into some equations to figure out how much you actually need to inject of a solution. The nice thing is there's fertilizer calculators out there for you to use. And Clemson University just came out with a really nice one that works on your cell phone. So it's a nice app. So you can go here. These are some of the common products you're going to find out that are pre-dissolved. So, and again, like I said, it's not hard to do it, but you can go to this fertilizer calculator. It could be one of these or something else that you find locally. You type that in, you figure, you know, and that will go through and it'll actually walk you through the steps you need to figure out to how much nitrogen you need to actually put out on the crop at any given time. Like I said, I can show you the math, but it's unpleasant. So, but it's not, it's like I said, this isn't a math class. So, but if you want to know how to do it, send me an email and I'll show you the information. So, all right. There are ample sources of organic nitrogen out there, and I will place a caveat on it right now because with FSMA, the Food Safety Act, there are some issues with some of the products that are on the market right now that may not be compatible with FSMA right now. So there's a lot of issues surrounding that. So some of the fertilizers. So this is one of the products I used to use an awful lot of was this trout-based product. So what they do is they took the carcasses from the trout, put it in a chamber, and basically let it ferment, mix it in with some water and some other elements, and they ended up with this nice brown slurry that just smells awful. But it worked really well. It was nice, and sometimes with the organic fertilizers, emulsions will form. You know, you'll get these layers that'll form in the fertilizer. So, and that's not always a good sign. So, you know, you want it to be fairly uniform. And this was like a chocolate McDonald's milkshake. But there are some good products out there, and they're expensive. So if I'm an organic grower, fertilizer costs are significant. They're usually almost 10 times more per unit nitrogen. Some folks at Cornell did a study, and what they found was that basically compared to 1 pound of inorganic nitrogen, some of the fertilizers that are out there were upwards of 22 pounds for some products. For the organic, 108 for some others. So it's costly. I'm not saying don't do it, but realize there's a significant expense associated with it. And a lot of those products, unfortunately, are small. You know, have very small amounts of nitrogen, 1 to 2% or less than 4%. So that means you've got to use a whole lot more of that product to meet the plant's demand. And again, the plant really doesn't care if it's, you know, organic or inorganic. They want nitrogen. That's the key, or N or P or K. So any of these things will work. All right. One thing you can still do in organic certified operations is you can use sodium nitrate. that can be and it's soluble, so it's upwards of 20% of your production you can use sodium nitrate. So it's not a bad option. It's a mine product, but it's pricey, because the biggest issue you run into here and I run into in Alabama is finding the source of the product and getting it to you. So you end up spending a lot on shipping, or you got to go drive and pick it up. So that's unfortunately always one of the issues. All right, types of injectors out there. So there are so many types of injectors out there, and they basically all do the same thing. But I will say some are simply better than the others when it comes down to it. But and some are sort of like really good starter versions of what you might need to use. Volumetric proportioners, these are the Dosatron, Dosmatic. There's several brands out there. They're expensive. They're hydraulic driven, but they're remarkably precise. For research purposes, I like using these things because of the precision, and they're accurate. So, and they're very adjustable. You can do a lot of things with it. They do make industrial versions of these things that a grower can buy or you can buy. The unfortunate thing is these start at $250 to $300 and more. But it's the nice thing. But on the other side is you basically buy a rebuild kit for it. It's like reworking a carburetor. You buy new gaskets and things like that. So you can maintain these things for a very long period of time. So you have that initial cost, but you can maintain it really well. This is a proportioner, so a proportioning fertilizer injector. Basically what you do is you put fertilizer into it, and then this particular one has a knob on it where you can actually change the knob, and that will affect how much water goes into the reservoir here where the fertilizer is. And basically the water goes in here, it mixes around, then some of it gets shunted back up into the main flow of the water. These are not very precise. These are, you know, like the, for cattle, the chlorinators and the brominators kind of thing. That's exactly what it is. Matter of fact, I see some growers actually use this, but these are really imprecise. If I'm a small grower, if I have a quarter of an acre or a couple of high tunnels, this is not a bad choice. And these are only 30 or 40 bucks. So, but they are not precise. So like I said, so if you're really looking at precision, that wouldn't be the version to get. The other ones, the Venturi types, Mozzie is a bigger version. This is a Venturi type. So that means it works by a physical, actually I'll show you the picture. So that's right, let's go back to the next thing. Anyway, this is a very inexpensive version of a Venturi. So there's two brands, Siphon X and Hose On. What these work really well for is if I have a high tunnel, this will do a 1:16 proportion, so I can have my base fertilizer, whatever concentration I'm trying to get. Normally in the back of the fertilizer, soluble fertilizer, it'll have a chart. And it'll say, all right, for a 1:16 injection ratio, I put this much into a gallon of water to get 100 ppm of nitrogen, or some other combination to that. So these work really well on a small scale, and actually these little Venturis, this will work on up to about a quarter of an acre. The biggest problem with these is, this particular brand is, it simply cannot move enough water through it to go much more than a quarter of an acre. And these are 20 bucks. So, but if I'm a transplant grower or if I'm growing in a high tunnel, these really work pretty well to get some fertilizer out. This is also a proportion. I see these all over the place. This is another one of these proportioning injectors. So does anybody ever use one of these things? I see these in catalogs, and they're inexpensive. So, but it's basically the same kind of thing I showed you before, that sort of smaller version. This is just a spray tank, you know, that's got some adapters on it, you know, and so you put your fertilizer in here, the soluble fertilizer in here, water go through, you hook up the main line of your the hose going, you know, here, and it'll force some water to go down here. You have some ability to control the flow rate, not much. And again, these aren't particularly expensive. This particular one, I think, was probably 40 bucks. You could buy them up into the 5-gallon range that, you know, they're about 60 to 70 bucks. But again, they're not particularly precise. They take a long time to put out a small quantity of fertilizer. But but that may be suitable for your operation. I'm growing one crop. I have one high tunnel. I may not need anything particularly fancy. This may actually work well for me, but it requires some degree of patience on your part, because it may actually, you simply may not be putting out the amount of fertilizer you need quickly enough to meet the plant's demand. But in some cases, these work great for greens. You know, if I'm growing lettuces and things like that that have a fairly short cycle, not a huge demand of nitrogen, these things work really well for crops like that. But for tomatoes, like I said, you sort of run into a situation where you cannot get enough fertilizer through that to meet that crop's demand. So, all right. This is an old tile one. old style one, a chemical injection pump. These were sort of adapted in the 70s to work with fertigation. You don't see these much anymore. Basically, all these do is that you hook these up into the main line. They will extract this much water from the flow of irrigation. Then they will insert that much, whatever volume it took out, into the flow. And they're actually remarkably precise. They work really well, but they normally require power. There are some hydraulic-driven ones, but I have not seen one of those in probably 20 years. So, but they're remarkably precise. But they're also, this is also the $500 or $600 version. These are actually, it's sort of cool. These are actually were developed for submarines so many years ago, so from the nuclear navy. So this is one of those things you can thank World War II for. And it just sort of found its way into agriculture eventually. This is the Venturi. I already showed you a picture of the small version of it. So this is a 3/4 inch Mozzie. Has anybody ever heard that name? Mozzie is an Italian company, and they make some of the best injectors out there. These are precise. They're not as precise as like the Dosatrons out there, but if I'm a starter grower and I'm just have a couple of acres out there, this is really a good one to go. This is a 3/4 inch one. They make them on up to, I think, up to 12-inch diameter. This is $60. That's several thousand. You know, so basically, I don't understand the pricing for this stuff. So little tiny things, when you hit like the 1-inch range, the prices just shoot up exponentially. But they work well. They're made out of chemical-resistant products. The little hose on I showed you, they're made out of brass, so they wear. So after a couple years, what you may find is they just don't work right anymore. You can't get it to suck any solution up into it. I find these really to be probably one of the most useful injectors out there. Like it's basically this is the main line of water coming through here. So, and this is a bypass. You have a pressure, I'll show you a better picture of this in a second, but basically by creating a pressure differential between the high end and the low end, this will start sucking product into it. So, and it's got some degree of, you have some degree of being able to do variable levels of injection with it. So, and it's much more precise than some of those, like those chemical tanks and things like that. But this is about, I think these are about $65, $70 now. They may seem like a lot, but it'll last for many years. So, and then with the rest of this piecing, you know, you could do, this is the kind of thing you could do for probably less than $100. And a 3/4 inch Mozzie will do multiple acres, depending on what you're trying to inject and how quickly you're trying to do it. So I use these a lot with chemigation. I work with an entomologist at Auburn, and we do a lot of chemigation. There's a lot of products that can be injected through, and actually some fungicides that can be injected that has some systemic activity. So if you ever decide to try to get into something like that, you'll see a lot of pesticide labels do allow chemigation. This is a good one to start with, so because it is precise. This is the typical setup you'll see in the farm. So I'll go through here and show you what we got. There we go. All right, this is the inflow side here. So this is going to the city or the well, whatever you've got here. You've got a cutoff valve. Then you've got a backflow prevention device. Now, some counties, if you're on county or city water, they may have specific, regulations saying you've got to have double check valves or some other kind of combination of things out there. But basically, all this does is prevent fertilizer flowing backwards into your well. I have seen that happen. I've seen wells come out with blue water because they accidentally, inject, everything reversed itself and you pulled the fertilizer right back into the well. So, and blue water does not taste good. So anyway, this is a pressure reducer. A lot of times, most county, remember I said these operate under low pressure, so 10 to 12 psi. Normally from a well or city water, you may have 70, 80 psi typically coming through it. So you typically need to reduce it, and that's what this is. This is a variable rate pressure reducer, so you can actually change it based on whatever's coming into it. The next thing you've got is a pressure gauge, obviously, because you want to see how well this is working if you knock down the pressure. Normally, when you inject something, you want to maintain pressure as high as you can until you actually inject it. Then right at the point of the field where we've got the drip lines going out, that's where you want to knock the pressure down. So you always want to try and maintain as much pressure you can until you actually get out into the field. I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. The next thing is, here is the Mozzie. Here's the bucket of fertilizer that we want to put out. This is a cutoff valve, and again, the Mozzie. And what you do is you've got a pressure gauge here and a pressure gauge here, and you turn the water on, and you start closing that valve, and as soon as you get about a 10% difference in pressure between the high side and the low side, the Mozzie injector will begin working. And as long as the flow rate is constant, it'll work just fine. Now, obviously, if the well is just turning on and you're filling up your lines, this won't work well. So it's got to have a nice constant pressure. These Mozzies are designed to work at certain pressure levels, so you can get them all over the board in terms of what whatever the particular situation is you're dealing with. You want to make sure you get the correct injector for the flow rate, so the number of gallons a minute going out through the system, and the pressure and things like that. This is a disc filter. This will help. In this particular case, this man has a well, and he had a lot of particulate in his well. And this disc filter will help remove sand particles. So depending on the particular water source you're dealing with, normally below ground water sources simplify irrigation significantly. Once you have an above ground system, that requires a higher level of filtration. So the water goes through, it cleans it up, you inject it, you still have water going through here, you've got fertilizer coming up through here, it gets mixed in here. You've got another small Y filter, that's WYE. This is a screen filter. This gets at any particles of undissolved fertilizer out of there, because particles of sand, small particles of sand, are actually big enough to clog emitters. So you want to do anything you could possibly do to make sure you block any of that stuff here at this point. So, and of course you've got the outflow here. So this is the basic setup. So you can insert any other injector into this case. You can have a dosatron. You could have one of those proportioners. Anything you like. This is all the basic setup that you typically would have for injection. All right, 2 schools of thought when you're dealing with injection typically. Either you're following the growth of the plant, basically, putting out the same amount of fertilizer every time, and I'll show you an example of that. The other is, and that's called the even distribution model, and the other is following the plant growth curve, which is the one I tend to prefer, but I'll show you examples of both of these. And they both have their pluses and minuses. With the plant growth curve injection, the amount that you inject depends on the stage of growth and the particular crop you might be growing. But you're less likely to waste fertilizer. This is a much more precise system. The even distribution, you're always putting out the same amount of fertilizer every day or every other day, how often you're doing it. It's easy to keep track of. You're always dealing with the same thing. You're not altering anything. But you tend to over-fertilize when the plants are young, then you tend to under-fertilize when the plants get older. So you never optimize your growth of your crop. Just to show you a quick example, so if this is using the same rate, on plasticulture, we use much higher rates of fertilizer. In Alabama, if I'm growing on bare ground with irrigation, it should normally 90 to 110, 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. On plasticulture, we go upwards of 150 up to 200 in some cases on the sandier soils, because we're going to get bigger plants. We're going to get hopefully 2 or 3 times more yield, so we've got to push the plants a little bit more, and we have to have the fertilizer there to meet the plant's needs. So soil test, you put out 100% of the P, magnesium, calcium, limestone, etc., anything else, boron, that your soil test calls for. You put out pre-plant, say 20 to 40% of the needed nitrogen and potassium. So that leaves you post-planting 6 to 80% of the nitrogen and potassium that you need to put out via fertigation. So this is a very simple, like I said, a simple example. So we need to put out 200 pounds of nitrogen. We put out 50 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant, so that leaves 150. For tomatoes, it's typically about a 14 to 15-week season. So if we put out 5-week-old transplants, we figure about a 14-week season from when they go in. That's about 10.7 pounds of nitrogen per acre per week, or about 1.5 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day. You all follow? So it's pretty simple. It's just this simple math. I'm not giving you anything I think that's going to give you a headache. All right. With the plant growth model, remember, injection depends on the stage of the growth of the plant, and you're less likely to waste fertilizer, et cetera. So we have really good schedules, fertigation schedules, and I'm going to show you one for peppers, tomatoes, watermelons, small melons, cucumbers, okra, and squash. Your Midwestern Handbook has some of that information in there. So, and the neat thing is with these fertigation schedules is it doesn't matter if I'm here or in Australia. They're all going to work for you. But it's a starting point, which you may find over time is through soil testing and doing your soil, your leaf analysis. You're going to tweak it. So these are starting points for you. So if I'm a new grower starting out, this is how you start. This is a typical fertigation schedule that you'd find in our vegetable handbook. This is for field-grown tomatoes. So pre-plant, the same thing. You know, you put out that portion, and you put out 50 pounds pre-plant, and in this particular case, 125 pounds of potassium. The 98 days, so that 14, 15 weeks schedule production period. So for when we start injecting, we want to start putting out about a half a pound of N and half a pound of potassium for the first 2 weeks. Then we begin steadily bumping that up as we get obviously into heavier production. So, and ultimately, we get to 2.5 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day. So, however we decide to put this out, if I'm on a very sandy soil, more frequent injections are always the better option. On a heavier soil, more clayey or maybe a more loamy soil, you could probably get away with doing it, 2 or 3 times a week. But more frequently is always better. You're spoon feeding the plants. So if you still put it out in plugs, you do it once a week, you're probably still not optimizing your system. You're not really taking advantage of the plasticulture system. And remember, you've already invested the money, so you might as well keep going to that next step and really do it the way it needs to be done. Does everybody follow this? Now, if I were to show you some other of these fertigation tables, which you might see in the case of like eggplant, the number would actually begin decreasing. So basically we hit a peak, then we begin going down. But it depends on the crop. But these have been developed through research for the last 40 years. So I feel pretty firm when I tell somebody, this is how you start, for your crop. And this could be applied on, it doesn't have to be on an acre basis. It could be a half an acre. It could be a high tunnel. So you can break it up on the, pounds per square feet based on this. So we know there's 43,560 square feet in an acre. So we can use that math to figure out how much we actually need to put out per square foot. All right, leaf tissue analysis. Dr. Snyder already mentioned it. The neat thing about tomatoes is we have intervals we have sufficiency values for a number of stages of plant growth. In the case of tomatoes, we've got good numbers for a determinate as well as indeterminate varieties. In this case, this is for determinate. So I know I can take a sample at mid-bloom of the first cluster all the way down to the sixth cluster, and I'll show you here, I can get these values are called sufficiency values. This sufficiency value is telling you that your plants should have this much nitrogen at this stage of growth. If it doesn't, you need to bump up your fertility program. Maybe your plants are growing a lot more vigorously, and they need more than that 1.5 pounds per acre of nitrogen per day. This is how you figure that out. This is how you track what you're doing and you really optimize your production. This will change from year to year, from season to season. What you'll find is, this year it's been a lot colder than it has been. The plants are growing a lot more slowly. So it may stretch out that time period of you needing to put out more fertilizer more quickly. It may be stretched out, and so instead of the first 2 weeks, it may be the first 16 to 17 days you find that 1.5 pounds per acre of nitrogen per day actually works out pretty well. Go back here. Anyway, for horticultural crops, we have manuals for this. So every horticultural crop you could and every row crop, trees, nursery crop, fruit crops, small fruits, tree fruits, have sufficiency values. So as a grower, these are awesome. This is really the only way you can really figure out what's going on inside the plant. You never want to get to the point where the plant is showing a deficiency symptom. So these leaf tissue samples can show something called hidden hunger. So it's before the deficiency actually becomes apparent in the foliage, because once that happens, depending on the nutrient, you might have actually already impacted your yield negatively. So in the case of nitrogen, probably not. After 2 or 3 days, the plants tend to bounce back pretty quickly, and you don't see a lot of ramifications. But that's not so for some of the other ones. All right. For tomatoes, you take 12 to 15 of the most recently matured leaves. If you're looking at the whorl on the top of the tomato, you typically count down basically 4 to 5 leaves, and that's the leaf you take. So the whole thing right down to the stem. You'd walk through the field and you try to take, if the field is fairly uniform, all the same variety, you could take one sample for a field. If you have multiple ages, you probably want to take multiple samples. You know, it's like sample A from this setting, sample B from this setting, et cetera. So, but it, like I said, it is an excellent diagnostic tool, and really, and the only way you can figure out what's going on in the plant. I just simplified it. You know, you're going to get a particular, this is just from some work I did last year with the grower just tracking the progress of his tomato crop. So, and I just highlighted in red where I saw numbers that were low at that particular given time. So what you can do is you can take this information, you can put it in a notebook for yourself, and you can track your crop. You can look at it next year at the same time and say, all right, where was I at last year at this time? You can go back and you can look in your notebook and say, all right, here's about where I was at. This may seem like an added expense to go, how much do leaf tissue samples cost here in Missouri?
So the basic sample test for
Okay. Considering the cost of the fertilizer, if I'm growing 1 acre tomatoes, what do you know what the pre-harvest costs are for tomatoes? Tomatoes are the most expensive crop to grow, most expensive vegetable crop. We typically in pre-harvest costs have someplace around $6,000 invested per acre. So multiply that times 10 acres, 100 acres. $23 is a tiny investment to make sure your crop is where it's at, because ultimately this information is going to help you optimize the crop and get everything out of that crop that you could have gotten. You know, so look, it's an investment. You know, so that's definitely the way to look at it. That Patrick's already talked about that. For some other elements, we talked. Actually, we're talking about a little bit of irrigation, so we're going to skip some of that. Obviously, fertigation is one part of it. The other part of it is obviously just simply irrigation. So remember, irrigation control is critical. The neat thing is there's a lot of really cool tools that are out there for vegetable growers, even if it's a small area, and I'll show you some of those things now. But remember, veggies are 85 to 95% water, depending on the vegetable you might be growing, so you're selling a sack of water. You know, you never want to let that plant suffer for water because you're not going to get the size out of it. You're not going to get the money in the end because it's almost all by weight for the most part. So bigger is better in this particular case, so you want to make sure you maintain that crop. I said earlier, so typically for drip irrigation, it's going to cost you in that $250 to $450 range. That depends on basically what you've got going already. You know, what's out there. Is it a well? Is it city water? Or are you pulling out of a pond? That's going to affect sort of some of the particular pieces of equipment you use. It also aids in disease management. High tunnels are excellent. Matter of fact, we have high tunnel growers in Alabama that grow organic tomatoes. It is the only way they can grow organic tomatoes in Alabama is by and they're using, you know, we talk about 4-season high tunnels, and then we talk about single-season high tunnel, meaning all it is a high tunnel that basically looks like a carport. All it is a covering. And what you're doing is you're keeping the plant's foliage dry. As the professor who went before me was talking about foliar diseases, keeping the plant foliage dry is just key. It will help you manage diseases, and hopefully, if you're managing it, you don't have to worry about spraying for it. So keeping the plant, and the plant is, as contrary as this may sound to you, the plant does not have to have its leaves wet during growing. 99.9% of the water and all the nutrients come up through the roots. That's where everything needs to be. So the foliage can stay dry. So the only problem you run into that is like on strawberries in the high tunnel, so that Farmer Dre mentioned, that is almost a magnet for spider mites. Hot, dry, in a high tunnel, they love that. So, and I've got some ideas that might be able to help you. I'm happy to talk to you about tomorrow. So, but generally speaking, we want it to be dry. So, drip irrigation, when it's set up properly, like I've already mentioned, will put out water uniformly. It doesn't matter how big the system is. So, and again, it's not a soaker hose. It's a very precise way to put out water on an area, regardless of the size of the area. Things that you need to think about when you're putting out an irrigation system. You need to know the water source. So I keep harping on that, but that's going to affect the level of filtration that's going to be required to make the system run correctly. And I'll show you what some of those options look like. When it's a below ground water source, the nice thing about that is they almost always are cleaner. We don't have to worry about debris. We don't have to worry about algae. or rats getting stuck in the line. I have pulled out all kinds of interesting things out of above ground water sources, so in line. So it's amazing what can actually get in these systems. So things you need to know about the well. You can call up an a certified irrigation engineer, and he's going to ask you for certain pieces of information. He'll likely ask you, what crop are you growing? What is your well source? How many gallons per minute does your well source at the wellhead produce? Because that's going to tell you how much area you can actually irrigate at a given time. You know, you only have as much water as your well will produce. So that may tell me, says, all right, I know I can irrigate 5 acres at a time with a high flow tape in this particular situation, or that says maybe I need to make some other options. That's where, when I mentioned earlier, so sometimes locally you find one type of drip tape. You find, one set of this, one set of that. You don't find the gamut that's actually out there for drip. There's actually 3 types of drip tape out there. There's low flow, medium flow, and high flow tapes. So, and there's a reason why they're out there, because those are going to be mated to various situations where they work much better for you. So a lot of times when growers in my area, they go out, they buy a tape, they go, whatever they get from their local co-op, and they have problems, and they call me, and we talk about the design, and we look at the setup, and I realize that's really not the best tape that they should be using in that situation. So ask these questions ahead of time, so you make sure you set it up correctly, ultimately. So, like I said, if you're going to talk to me or talk to an engineer or designer, they're going to ask you some of these very basic things. They're going to want to know the contour of the land, so that may also affect the type of drip tape that you select. This is where you run into the big difference in costs in terms of your filtration. So these are twin media filters. These are 18-inch stainless steel media filters. The nice thing is these will last you forever. The bad thing is they're $1,500, so it's not a small price tag. Right now, though, you can buy fiberglass versions of these, so which are $400 for the small ones. But obviously, fiberglass is not going to last forever. Stainless steel will. So this is the kind of thing you could build yourself into ultimately. Especially if you're moving a lot of water and filtering a lot of water, you may find that in the long term, that may be the better option. But that's something you're going to need if you're using an above ground water source. You need to be able to filter it. I hesitate to call, these are like pool filters, but I hesitate to say that because I have seen people try to use pool filters to do this, and they're not designed for the pressure, and they tend to explode. So don't do that. So, but these work in tandem. So what happens is you also use one of these to flush out the other. So you prevent water from going through one system, and you force clean water, basically. Here's the water coming in. You force water to go through the filter. It's cleaned. Then you'll force water down this way, and it'll go out a port, and that helps you flush out all the particles that actually have accumulated in there. There's sand in there. There's going to be some screening and some pebbles, like river pebbles, that are smooth inside. So obviously you need a pump of some type. Either coming into it. So that's the other part of the equation. Pumps are not cheap. So a lot of the basic pumps are going to start $300 or $400 and then move up from there. When you're dealing with a below ground water source, price tag is usually the issue. If I'm using city water in my area, it would cost me a fortune to try to irrigate my vegetables with it. So, but there are other options out there. Some counties, it's not bad. In Alabama, we have an option called, they're called garden meters. So, because a lot of places in Alabama, we have to pay for the water coming in, but we also have to pay, assuming it's sewer going out. So, there are some options depending on the particular area you happen to be in. So that's the kind of thing you can explore here. So that's but the difference is, like I said, $1,200–1,500 for this. This is about $60. So obviously, it's a big difference in cost. Here are the fiberglass ones, and when I priced these a few years ago, they were only $400, and I think they're about $525 now, and these are 18-inch, and basically they're gauged based on your water source, how much water is going to be going through there. They have 12-inch diameter, then they go 16, 18, 24. I think on up to 6 or 10 feet. They're huge. If you go out into California, you can find these things that are almost 10 feet wide or larger. But they're sort of the universal standard for filtering water. Anyway, and here's the basic setup. I showed you that picture of the typical irrigation setup. This is just the scrunched version of it. If I have like a half an acre, a quarter of an acre, I'm trying to irrigate using above ground water, you can get away with something as simple as this to irrigate. All it is a check valve, so a little Y filter, a screen filter, a pressure reducer, and that's really all you needed. So, and you can actually add an injector into this thing at some point if you wanted to. So sometimes you may not need all those other bells and whistles I showed you if you don't intend to inject fertilizer, but if you're just using drip irrigation, you're not using, the black plastic on top of it, so. As I said, small openings are very easy to clog, so sand particles are big enough to actually clog the system. So, and rats and mice, other things that it can get in there. It is absolutely amazing the things you get in there. So, water analysis is always useful. Dr. Snyder mentioned that. It's critical for anything you do, but it's really critical for greenhouse production. So, because water quality, because you have no soil. Soil has a good capacity to be able to buffer what you put into it. So if you have a little bit higher sulfur, you've got a little bit higher, EC or something like that in the water, in most cases in field situations, that's not going to be an issue. So, but obviously in a greenhouse where water is absolutely key, it may be a problem. And you may end up having to acidify your water. A lot of the wells in this area are probably high pH, most likely. So we have wells in Alabama that have pHs around either very acidic, basically just under, 6.5 or lower, but we also have wells in the southern part of our state near Florida that are up in 7.4, 7.6. If I have a greenhouse, I'm probably having to acidify the water before it actually goes into the injection system. So there could be some issues, but like I said, in a field situation, it's usually not a problem. Potential problems, absolutely. The drier the year is, the more likely you're going to have mice, rats, or critters trying to excavate your drip tape to get water out of it. So this particular case, this is actually from mole crickets. So, but you can also, if I go from a pasture, all right, this year I've got pasture out there, I work up my land, I put lay some plastic out there, I can have a problem with grubs. Grubs will eat my plastic too. So, and they do it, but it's the kind of thing, if you know ahead of time, I know there's grubs out there, I can use, certain products like diazinon, which is a really good soil insecticide, will take care of the grub issue. There's other things you can do as well. So there's no shortage of potential problems that are out there. I'll talk about placement in a second, but placement's critical. So whether you put it on top of the soil or under the soil, that can actually affect the level of damage you can get from some things. All right. Drip tape selection, typically, on a sandier soil, we typically want drip tape that has a higher water infiltration rate. So a high float tape. On a more clayey soil that has a lower water infiltration rate, we typically want to have a tape that puts out less water. So, and that's just sort of something to keep in your back of mind. That's why I said, if there's only one option at your local dealer, that may not be the best option for you, and it may end up causing you a lot of headaches when you're trying to manage your drip tape and your irrigation. And so knowing these things ahead of time, but that's the kind of thing an expert can help you figure out. So, based on your situation, I think you should use this. Based on your well, we can use this kind of drip tape. One of the things I think is really funny to watch is when growers try to align the emitter in the drip tape with each plant. Impossible to do it. So I know that sounds silly, but I've seen people try to do it. So they'll say, oh, my plants are 12 inches apart, the emitters on my drip tape are 12 inches apart, and I need to make sure they line up. Almost impossible. You will drive yourself crazy trying to do that. So the reason being is if the drip tape is laid out correctly and you have nice firm beds out there, you will get lateral movement of water. You'll get water that moves across the bed, not just down. So that's sort of key in the bed formation process, so to make sure that's done correctly, that you get good water movement across the bed. There are a lot of tapes out there in terms of the emitter spacing, and you really try to match it with the crop, like if you're growing a mix of crops on the same area, you sort of want to look at the crop that has the highest water demand to figure out which tape to use. So if I'm growing pumpkins and I'm only growing pumpkins out there, I don't need to have 12-inch emitter spacing out there. So I can have 3-foot spacing, out there. So I don't need to be putting as much water out there typically, that I would on a crop that's more tightly spaced. You understand that? So, but typically, when I see people grow a mix of things, I usually tell them, what's the crop that's the most needy? That's probably the tape that you need to get because you want that one to be have its needs met. You'll probably be overwatering the other ones a little bit, but you don't want to underwater my tomatoes that are spaced 18 inches apart. Those are my cash crops typically. So, all right. Wall thickness, typically in here, you probably use 8 and 10 mil product. That means 1 mil is equal to 0.001 inches. So that's 1/1000th of an inch. That's the thickness of the tape. Typically, we use 8 and 10 mil products. You can get down to 6 mil products, but I find that in this area, if you have even a little bit of soil clotting, if you have stones, it tends to tear the tape up. It just doesn't last. You don't see much sold of that. So 8 and 10 tends to be the best. If I want to reuse my tape for multiple years, like in a high tunnel, I may have the same design. I lay the tape on top, and I throw some mulch over it. I could buy 25 mil tape. It's obviously a lot more expensive, but you can roll it up, you can put it in the barn, you can reuse it next year, and it'll last for multiple years. The 8 and the 10 mil products, they're really designed for single use. So anything obviously we get over that is a benefit, but don't expect to be able to like pull it up and reuse it next year. That is a challenge. I see people doing it, and I think they spend more time rolling it up, trying to keep it clean. So because it can get all kinds of clods, you've got to inject some acid to try to clean out any of the organic matter that be in there. So it's really quite a process to make sure it actually is in good shape, if you try to maintain the small stuff. But the larger stuff, yeah. I said there's low flow and high flow tapes. This is sort of the range you're going to see. So anywhere from 0.17 gallons on up to 0.4. There's some stuff that goes a little bit higher now, but that's the typical range. And almost always when I walk into a store and I see drip tape, it's almost always high flow tape. It's 0.35, 0.4. So that's putting out a lot of water, and it may not be what you need in your situation. The drip tape itself is very unlike soaker hoses. It's actually two tubes in one. So you've got the main tube, then you've got these little openings that you find through here. The water gets squeezed through it. Water gets forced through these little tiny holes in here. Then it'll go through this little tortuous path. So sometimes you'll hear the term turbulent flow. That's what this refers to, this is the turbulent flow. But this little sort of magic of physics here, this is what makes the water come out uniformly. This is what separates it from a soaker hose. So the physics associated with this make it uniform. This is why your fertilizer comes out uniformly. So it's just this little bit of magic that's done here. So this is part of I mentioned earlier about the little drip tape, the thing you put out, the really narrow plastic and drip tape. I thought I had the picture of the plastic layer too, but this is his version of just putting the tape out. So this was clever. You can buy drip tape in 9,000-foot rolls, or you can buy it in little 60-foot rolls, depending on what your particular desire is. Obviously, the bigger the roll, the cheaper it is. But this grower just came up with this clever little way on his little cultivator to put his drip tape out. And it's always better to bury your drip tape when you can. You basically take all this information that you've just figured out, like I said, in terms of looking at the soil situation, the crop, the field, the layout, everything, to figure out really what's the best tape for your particular situation. Remember, like I said, there's no universal type of situation. And there's expertise out there, so don't be afraid to ask. This isn't an ad for Irrigation Mart. Does anybody work with a company called Irrigation Mart? They're in Ruston, Louisiana. You can call them down. They have certified drip irrigation and engineers, and they'll do a design for you for free. Obviously, they're hoping you buy their product from them. They'll come in and install it for you, too. So obviously, there's a cost associated with that. But they've worked really well with small growers. They don't mind, typically, if somebody calls up and says, I need a $5 part. And I find that valuable. There's also another company in Cairo, Georgia, called Bell Irrigation. And you all have, I'm sorry, I can't remember the place here. I thought you had, didn't you have a... Oh, okay, yeah, I know I'd heard that before, I just couldn't remember the name of it. So there's places around to go, and obviously I always like being able to go local when I can. All right, with the proper design setup, it doesn't matter how big the system is. As long as you've got sufficient water to supply it, your system can be as large as you want it to be. But a lot of times we don't find that particularly useful. So we typically break the system up. We may have ages of crops to deal with or multiple different crops. So we will have a tendency to sort of break this stuff up. And that just becomes a plumbing problem, really. So it's very doable, but you end up buying more pieces of this, more pieces of that. Sometimes it's just nice to have one big uniform field, but realize the limitations. It may not be meeting all the particular needs you make. When you deal with scheduling irrigation, I can tell you the touch and feel operation is really not the best way to do this. You cannot see what's going on in that, underneath that plastic. I find tensiometers to be remarkably useful. Has anybody ever seen a tensiometer before? They're very simple. They work on soil suction, and tension. Basically, tension is negative pressure. So you put these devices in. I'll show you a picture one in a second. And they've got a ceramic tip on it. Water will move in and out of it based on how dry or how wet it is. And they have a gauge on it. So, and depending on your particular soil type, you're going to find a setting that spells where you need to be for that particular soil type. So to maintain the correct amount of available soil moisture to make sure your crop has what it needs. It's just one aerometer is one company that makes them. So you see this gauge, it goes from, this is actually negative, so 0 down to minus 100. You never get to 100 because that would be like out in the desert. But normally, zero is saturated. You're at field capacity. So then it gets more negative. A lot of our soils in Alabama, we normally start irrigation when we typically get anywhere from 12 to 8 on this gauge. So, and what you'll find is you can talk to a soil scientist here and he'll say, well, you need to do this and this is but these are an excellent way to do it and they're cheap. So 40 to 50 bucks, and Patrick has one. So they also make something called switching tensiometers. This is actually a gauge. This is actually connected in with a solenoid that will turn your irrigation off and on for you. So I do this a lot with research when I'm trying to maintain certain levels of things, but as a grower, this is pretty convenient. You hook it up to like anyone who's have an irrigation system for their home lawn. It's the same kind of thing. All it is just a little switch box that operates a solenoid, so you can control when you want it to come off and on. Scheduling irrigation, when it comes down to it, I think the most important thing for you to really remember. So, yeah, this is Patrick is kind enough to pass it around, so take a look at it. But you have to buy a little service kit to make these things work, and you draw a vacuum on it. You fill it up with some dye-colored water, and that maintains it. So, and you can save these from year to year. You clean off the tip. You always store it in water in the wintertime. You don't let it freeze, so you have to stick it in the house. The tips are usually replaceable, so you can send them back to the company, and they'll put a new tip on it for you, so to maintain it. But I think one of the biggest things I see typically growers do is they're either not enough water, or they try to, or not enough water or too much water, or they try to operate the thing for 24 hours. So drip systems are not designed to do that. Normally, you want to cycle your drip system. You leave it on for 2 to 4 hours, turn it off. If you need to run it for multiple hours during the day, basically based on your drip tape and the acreage you've got out there, you can, an engineer or I can help you figure out how long do I need to operate this system to put out 1 acre-inch of water. It's just a math problem, and we can figure that out based on the drip tape you've got. So based on that, you divide that by 7. So if I'm going to operate my system every day, it may come out and say, you need to operate your system for 3 or 4 hours every day to get that 1 inch of water out. This is not overhead. You're not putting a quarter of an inch of water out at a time. So it is literally dripping, just drip, drip, drip. If you ever see water streaming out of your drip tape, like in a spray, there's a problem. So just drip, 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 constant supply. So it takes time to keep that water out there, and that's why you never want to let your beds dry out completely, because if they do, that drip, drip, drip takes an awful lot of time to try to re-wet a bed that's been dried. So anyway, so does everybody understand that? I think that's probably the most important take-home message you can get. Never just let it run for 10, 12 hours. So.
Yeah, I think what's hard on our, are you supposed to be watering every day for a little bit? Or are you supposed to water deeply, like once a week?
Yeah, and with drip irrigation, it may be every day, and just because that's the way the system is designed.
So the answer, I guess, is just listen to the math.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
But you hear other stuff, like if you don't water deeply, then you're making your plants weak.
No.
Weak roots. Don't you hear that?
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, and and just don't think of it that way. Think of it in terms of efficiency. And that's dripping. Like I said, you can figure out exactly how long it takes, how many hours you need to run that system to put out that acre-inch. Most vegetable crops still need that, an inch of water out there. The difference is you're putting it out over a long period of time. If I'm on a sandy soil, I'm going to run my irrigation more frequently. I may want to do it every day or every other day. The systems can be automated so you don't have to worry about it, but you still should double check them. Like Dr. Snyder said, worry, check. That's the only way you're going to know this stuff. There's not an issue out there. If I'm on a more clay or loamy soil, I may be able to do it every other day, but chances are drip systems, like I said, drip systems are designed to operate daily. That's their function. And if you try to make up by just letting it run for 8, 10, 12 hours or overnight, you end up super saturating part of the soil and you lose most of that water to gravity. It just keeps going down. You don't get good lateral movement across the beds. That's what this is supposed to be done. So, was there another question? Okay. In most cases, the drip tape, you never want to run the drip tape more than 200 to 300 feet. The reason being is that 5/8 inch diameter hose can simply not carry that much water down it past 300 feet or 400 feet. Now, there are tapes that are designed to do that, but you have to specifically buy them. Most tapes, they max out at that 200 to 300 foot range. So make sure the drip tape is placed away from the plants. You can get these physical abrasions that occur just by putting it near the plant. Normally, what we want to do is something called shallow subsurface placement. We put it down 3 or 4 inches into the soil, 3 or 4 inches away from the plant. If I'm on a double row system, I would put it right on the middle of the plant. Right in the middle of the bed. So, do I need 2 drip tapes? In some cases, you might. Remember I showed you those pictures of the cantaloupes on those very wide beds? It's simply too wide for one single drip tape, so a lot of them will put out double rows of drip tape out in that particular situation to make sure they get a good wet front in that bed. The other thing, here's just another example of that. So, and this is just where I've taken off the plastic, and you can actually see the water percolating up. This is showing you some degree of lateral movement of that wetting front moving across the bed. If you were to look at this sort of like cut the soil away and look down at the profile, it would look like a ball, sort of a flattened ball on top of it. Like I showed you that picture of the fertilizer or that dye moving through. The other option is you could place it on the surface. So you can also just mulch on top of it. One of the things you run into when you stick it on top of the soil surface is it's subject to snaking. This is black. It will heat and it will cool, so it'll stretch and it'll retract as the sun hits it. It's also, I've noticed, it's a lot easier for people who are out there walking with a hoe to hit it when it's not buried. Or if I'm putting stakes out there and if I've left the tape under the plastic on the surface, that tape is going to snake, and I have seen many growers puncture the drip tape, and it is hard. You end up making a lot of holes in your plastic to patch up that the drip tape, and you can't just run down to the local 5 and dime store to find the little connectors to connect those together. You need specific types of connectors to actually work with the drip tape. So anyway, I think always burying it is always a good idea. But if I'm an organic grower, I'm just growing on the soil surface, you can mulch right over top of this. So, but what you want to do is you want to every couple of feet, you want to place some soil. They also make like those landscape fabric pins. You can take those and put those out, but you also want to remember they're out there because you don't want to plow them up later. So I've done that myself multiple times. So anyway, so put something on top of it just to weigh it down so it doesn't wander too much. All right. The last thing I want to show you, do I still have a minute or two, Patrick, or can I go another minute or two? Okay. Oh, awesome. All right. Oh, I'll talk for another hour. I don't care. So you don't have any place to be, do you? So you guys good? So we know in an acre there's 43,500 square feet, and that's really the most important math that you need right this second. How much water are you going to need? All right. So your well. You look out, all right, I know I want to operate on this many acres, okay? So how do you figure out how much water you actually need? Well, one, you figure out the drip tape. The second is, what is your row spacing? What's my center to center spacing? Obviously, the closer they are, the more water you're going to need per acre, and the further apart they are, the less water you're going to need. So this simple example, this is a high flow drip tape, all right? It puts out 0.4 gallons per minute per 100 feet. It has 12-inch emitter spacing. So that's part that I know. So what I do is some very simple math. I divide this. So 0.4 divided by 100 is .004 gallons per feet. That's how much it actually puts out. Then you take that number and you multiply it by the number of linear feet, either at 4 foot, 5 foot, or 6 foot, or whatever your spacing ends up being, so we can figure it out. And that's going to tell you how many gallons per minute you're going to need on an acre using that drip tape at that spacing for that particular emitter type. Does that make sense to you? So, and I can show you how to, this is pretty easy to do. I can show you how to do it yourself, or there's actually calculators online. If you Google on drip irrigation, there's like several of the drip companies actually have these websites. You can go to the website, you can Google on it, on how much drip, actually I think it's just how much drip tape do I need. You can Google on that, and sometimes these calculators will come up, you just put your numbers in. So I know if I have 1 gallon, I mean if I know if I'm using the 6 foot spacing, I need 29 gallons per minute. You often want to hedge a little bit, so you want to add a few gallons per minute on top of that, you know, because it will take a little bit more than just 29, but 29 is obviously the base. So if my well doesn't produce 29 gallons per minute, that's going to be a problem for me. So I'm either going to have to change my drip tape type, my emitter, the amount of flow comes out, or I've got to break it up. If my well, well only produces 10 gallons per minute, I can break it up into quarters or thirds in my area. That way, I will always be able to fully pressurize my system and to irrigate evenly. Because remember I said, it's important for the system to always be fully pressurized, and you always want to make sure you don't run out of water. So if you sort of work backwards in that, you can figure out how I need to break up my system. I can also, I work with a lot of limited resources farmers in Alabama, and a lot of them will irrigate with their home wells, whatever they're using for their property. And a lot of them produce very little water per minute, but we can use these low flow drip tapes. The one I was using at this time, it put out 0.17 gallons per minute per 100 feet with this particular emitter spacing. Again, I do that math. I just do the 0.17 gallons per minute divided by 100, and you get 0.0017 gallons per minute. That's not a lot of water. So if I'm trying to use 5 foot centers out there, I would only need 14.8 gallons per minute. So, and that's wholly different from needing 30. So I would need half as much water. So, and it works with smaller systems. And that's using a low flow tape. And that's why I said, look at your situation, look at your well. Sometimes we have just the opposite problem. We have a lot of center pivots in Alabama, and you guys probably have them too. Those wells are high capacity wells, and they'll blow apart the drip tape. So we actually have to knock pressure off. We have to put in these bypasses and do all kinds of interesting things that just ends up making the irrigation companies wealthy, or they end up putting a new well in. They'll put in a new size well or a new size pump in the well, just to as opposed to spending lots of money to try to retrofit something. So you can come up with any combination of things you could possibly imagine. Does that make sense to you all? So last thing, if I'm trying to figure out relative expenses, all right, this is where I got my $450 from. Based on, just using drip irrigation, no tape, no plastic. These are all the miscellaneous things that you need. You need lay flat or something else to actually get the water out there. The drip tape itself, the little pieces of things you need to splice everything together. And like I said, you cannot go just down to Lowe's or something like that. You need the specific lock spin fittings or specific fittings designed for that drip tape to work. Otherwise, you will never seal the things together. So you will drive yourself crazy. There's also other ways to sort of save pressure. You can connect your drip line directly to your lay flat, or you can use spaghetti tubing. So there's a lot of ways to do that. And if you use spaghetti tubing, you lose pressure and you lose volume. So you can go to direct connection and save some of that. So there's a lot of little things you can do like that to sort of make it all work out. Cucumbers on plastic. So getting ready to trellis them. So, all right. Any questions, comments? So, yes. No. So I'm just kidding. So no, actually PVC is nice. It's cheap. I like lay flat just because, if in Alabama we have a lot of people who use rented land, so they don't want to put any infrastructure in. So lay flat is like, it's like if you've not seen it, it looks like fire hose. It's reusable and things, and it's fairly inexpensive for a 300 or 400 foot length of this stuff. But using PVC, you can also use flat tubing. There's something called flat tubing, which is more like a polybutylene material. It's not, it's sort of rigid, but it's semi-flexible, and you can drive over it. Unlike, you really can't do that with PVC, but PVC is cheap. You know, and PVC you can use, because remember, basically you've got the long rows with the drip tape at. All that drip tape is going to be connected to some main line out there. I just chose the lay flat in this example, but you can have PVC at the head, and they make fittings that you can connect it directly with. You can also bury the PVC. If you have a if you're always going to have your rows basically in the same spot, you can just put a header row out there, you know, and have a little piece of PVC coming up that you just tap into every year, you know. But no, there's really no. It's just whatever you feel comfortable spending, is what it comes down. But they also make. There's a couple other products out there that are these semi-flexible tubing. It looks like really thick drip tape. That works really well. So, but you've got to sort of figure out how much water you need to get out, to your point, which size. It's really cheap. The reason I mention it is it's cheap, and it's basically single-use kind of stuff. But where this lay flat and the PVC certainly is reusable multiple times. Does that answer your?
If you get PVC free, you know it's
Oh, yeah. Can I get some of that too, or do you got some extra I can put on the plane with me or something? So. No, not for the tape. No, the tape is engineered specifically to put out water. You know, you can't just put. If you're thinking of like putting holes in the drip tape in the PVC, now that really doesn't work. But you can buy emitters that actually plug into that. So you could actually run like a 3/4 inch PVC down the row, and you can actually buy little drip emitters that plug into that. And those could be pricey though. Those could be $2 or $3 each. So they're used a lot in the nursery industry, typically. So, but you can look through a catalog and you can find any combination of things. But yeah, if you got it free, you can buy specific fittings that will join those things together. So.
how long is your drip tape lasting? 2 years?
The 8 to 10 mil material, if I take care of it, if I'm double cropping, it'll usually last a double crop without a problem. You try not to go much more than a year because it's really not designed to do that. The big problem is the maintenance of it. It clogs up. You'll get an accumulation of products in there. So you either have to end up using an acid or a base to dissolve the organic matter or anything else that might be stuck in there. So you have to keep maintaining it, but the problem is you can only do that so much because it's simply not designed for it. So now if I have the 25 mil material, that is designed to be cleaned. You know, so that's the kind of, it's much heavier obviously, and the emitters that are used in it are designed to last a much longer period of time. But in this drip tape, it's really designed for single use, you know, for one crop. You know, but obviously we try to stretch it out as many crops as we can. So.
Without running that PVC pipe on top of the grow bag.
Like in for a high tunnel or something, or just out in the field. Yep, that's okay. So, yeah, I mean, the biggest thing with it might, the biggest with PVC though. Remember, it's white. It's translucent. You will get algal growth in that. So, matter of fact, I guarantee it. So you'll get it. So a lot of times what people will do is they'll paint it black. So it heats up and you don't get sunlight getting in there and causing algae to grow. So I guarantee it'll clog stuff up. So a lot of times what you'll do too is you'll put a flushing valve. You can actually buy these little valves that are designed to shut off once the pressure reaches a certain critical point, and it's a self-flushing valve. So it helps get products out of there. They make it for drip tape, they make it for PVC, and they make it for almost any other kinds of systems that are used as these header rows. You all sort of follow that? So it's really up to your imagination and how much you want to spend. But if you get free PVC, I'd be opting to say, yeah, I'm going to use that free PVC, and it may be cheaper to buy those $2 or $3 emitters. They also make spray stakes where you actually take a drill, you put a nipple, a bib into that connects into it, and then spaghetti tubing, and it goes out to the plants. That's pricey. That's normally for vegetable crops. It's not done because there's so many of them out there. But it certainly can be done. So, yeah. Ramon, did you have?
I was going to make a comment. If you want to use the PVC and you're going to take it out after the season, it's going to be a lot of work too.
Yeah.
And the second part is you don't leave it on top of it, particularly here, not so much over there, but it freezes and will break it.
Yeah.
If
That's
You
true.
don't flush it.
Yeah,
So the recommendation would be buried then, if you want to have it permanent.
yeah.
So you can't bury it because we're using grow bag.
Oh,
Well, then you make sure you flush it, otherwise it will break.
you can also just buy, they make spaghetti tubing that has a pretty large diameter to it that could run many spray stakes. So you could have one main line where the PVC comes up, and you can have spaghetti tubing going down, depending on how long your rows are, how many bags you're dealing with. So that's the kind of thing where an irrigation engineer could help you figure that out. You know, I said, well, honestly, for flushing it, you make sure to flush it, but I wouldn't use antifreeze, although that won't bother the plants too much. So, but it's not going to be very effective. You really, if you inject an acid or a base through there to clean the system out, that's usually ample, you know, so. But Ramon's right, so it will freeze and crack, so, and it's hard to roll PVC up. You just can't roll it up in a big spool, so. But yeah, if you get it free, shoot, yeah, so. But there are so many ways to do it. Since I work with a lot of limited resource people, I always try to think on the cheap. And that's sort of where these numbers came in, you know, and this is sort of one of the cheapest ways to do this. So, but even with just irrigation, I should double my yields on bare ground just with irrigation in Alabama. I know I can double my yields of tomatoes and greens and a lot of other crops. So that $450 investment makes sense for a lot of crops. So, you sure don't want me to go for another hour? You guys good? Well, you've been a very attentive audience, and thank you. And I appreciate the invitation. So.